In this video, we'll be beginning to discuss the philosophy of William James called Pragmatism, and also, I believe, discuss Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein as our entry into the 20th century, leaving behind Nietzsche and continuing in towards our own era, and pragmatism as a particularly American philosophical system. William James bridges the divide between psychologist and philosopher excellently. You'll notice texts with titles like The Principles of Psychology, The Varieties of Religious Experience, A Study in Human Nature, and Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking, and his philosophy spanning the divide between the late 19th century, early 20th. Pragmatism can perhaps best be defined as the philosophy that what is good, moral, right, and true is what is useful or practical. That's what pragmatic means in everyday language, and it means the same thing in philosophy. But furthermore, a central claim of pragmatism is that metaphysical differences are considered to be less important than practical solutions. This has been what's referred to as meliorism. It comes from the word in English, ameliorate. To ameliorate is to make something better. So meliorism, as a set of ideas under the heading or within the framework of pragmatism, is a philosophy based on the attempt to make the world or a specific problem in it less of an issue, or better, especially through pragmatic solutions. A prime real-world example of this is a company, an organization called Ducks Unlimited. Ducks Unlimited is a cooperative endeavor between duck hunters and environmentalists. This is an odd pairing because usually duck hunters, or hunters in general, and environmentalists and bird watchers would seem to have different end goals in mind. Environmentalist bird watchers want to watch birds. Duck hunters want to kill birds. So these two groups seem like they have perfectly opposing end goals in mind. However, given those, what we could call metaphysical differences, there is a practical, melioristic solution, a pragmatic solution, which can benefit both of them, even notwithstanding the ultimate differences between them. What the duck hunters and the environmentalists came to the conclusion is that by preserving wetland habitats, or very literally swampland, both of their interests could be served practically regardless of the ultimate conflicts between them. What's of interest here is that most people don't like swampland. It doesn't serve much of a purpose to real estate developers or farmers. It's got bugs and snakes and mosquitoes and crocodiles, etc. But duck hunters need swamps for there to be waterfowl. And environmentalists want to save swamps because not only do they serve as an important ecosystem for waterfowl and other creatures, they serve a number of environmental services and benefits. And so, even though the duck hunters want to kill the ducks, and the environmentalists want to save the ducks, these two groups literally are both benefited by a solution which serves both their interests. This is an example of what is good being what's useful, and where the ultimate end goals, hunt the ducks, save the ducks, are less important than practical solutions, save the wetlands. The second text we will discuss is called The Will to Believe. And in it, William James appears to be providing a defense, psychologically, of religious belief. And what he argues is that in our lives, we make a number of decisions. And these decisions may be forced decisions or completely free. They may be about things that are trivial or about things that are momentous. And lastly, they may be about options which he refers to as either live or dead. The last dichotomy is what is of interest for us here. A live option is one that you could realistically see yourself partaking in. A dead option is the opposite, one you couldn't imagine choosing. To make this as clear and as simple as possible, what William James is trying to answer, among other things, is why the religions of the world are geographically clustered. Why are they bunched up, with all the members of one religion being in particular areas, all the members of another religion being in other particular areas? Why aren't the religions just spread out at random? And his explanation is that there are a number of features that are cultural, communal, and social, which influence our decisions regarding which religion we will choose to be a part of. For example, if you grew up in Calcutta, India, Hinduism likely would be a live option for you. If you grew up in Nepal, Buddhism would likely be a live option to you. If you grew up in Japan, Buddhism or Shintoism would be equally live options. And ultimately, you don't, at the end, have to choose between them. If you grew up in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, Islam would be a live option to you. Same as if you had grown up in Islamabad, Pakistan. And if you grew up in Italy, Germany, France, England, Spain in the last quite a few hundred years, or the United States of America, not to mention places like Central and South America. Christianity would be a live option to you. In my face-to-face, in-person classes, I ask students from around this geography what the percentage likelihood of them joining a religion like Buddhism is. For some students, it's 10% chance they could see themselves joining Buddhism. For some, 50% chance. Some already are Buddhist. For those people, Buddhism is a live option. It's something they could reasonably see themselves partaking in. But for some of my students, I imagine those who are professed Christians or Muslims, the prospect of conversion to Buddhism carries zero likelihood. For them, Buddhism is a dead option. There's no way in a million years they'd convert. For them, if they're Christian, Christianity is a live option. It's so much a thing they could see themselves partaking in, they likely already do partake in. Same for Islamic students. The reason why, for example, for many of my non-Indian students, Hinduism, the worship of Shiva, Vishnu, Brahma, is a dead option for them is because people might think they're weird if suddenly they switched to what would effectively be someone else's religion. But if they were to go to the local Christian youth group, no one would think they're weird. Instead, there's actually an extremely strong social peer pressure to encourage them to go to those. In the same way that in Islamic parts of the world, there's an extremely strong social peer pressure to participate in the Islamic faith. All of which is trying to express that the religions we choose, or the religions we ultimately become a part of, we don't just pick from a hat at random, any one equally as likely as any other. Instead, the religion that we choose is the one that makes sense in our cultural context. It's the one that's normal, socially acceptable, and often we have a peer pressure to be a part of. Now, given that psychological awareness that William James tries to make possible, take an example of a 14-year-old girl who grows up in Islamabad, Pakistan. She's Muslim. Her family's Muslim. Her family going back for generations is Muslim. And imagine she goes out to the market one day and sees a Christian missionary. And the Christian missionary asks, "Why don't you convert to Christianity?" And the young woman says, "No, I'm Muslim. My family's Muslim. All my family going back generations is Muslim. I'm going to stay Muslim. In fact, why don't you convert to Islam?" And they agree to disagree and go on their separate ways. And now imagine that as the woman is heading home, she gets hit by a bus and dies. Very sad. But if she reaches the afterlife and is asked, "Why didn't you convert to Christianity? You had the option to. You had the free will to." William James provides us context for why she wouldn't have. In her cultural context, Islam was a live option and made sense. Everybody around her was Muslim. Her entire life history is one of Islam. Her social culture strongly influenced and socially peer pressured her to remain Muslim. It's incredibly hard to make sense of what psychologically would have any reason to motivate her. Christianity might be ever so slightly a live option, but Islam is so much more a live option to her because of her cultural context. In the final analysis, then, to answer William James's question, why are the religions of the world geographically clustered? This explanation involving live and dead options goes a long ways towards answering that. Furthermore, and lastly, it seems then that the biggest determining factor in what religion a person is mostly where they were born. So, does God want children who are born in Saudi Arabia to be Muslim? Does God want children who are born in India to be Hindu? Children born in China to be Confucian or Buddhist? If in fact every religion, every person on earth is supposed to convert to Christianity, some have an easy go of it, and some have such an uphill climb as to make it nearly, if not practically, impossible or unimaginable. For William James, he's not only attempting to explain why religious belief is justified, but moreover, why and how psychologically a variety or diversity of religious belief is justified. Thus, for our context of multiculturalism, intercultural communication, such as your paper was about, William James, psychologically as well as philosophically, helps us to understand why people are of different religions. To put it most simply, because that's what makes sense to them, given the various factors that influence their cultural context, and which make some religions more live options and some more dead. Before we finish out this video, a few brief words on one or two other philosophers. Bertrand Russell is an amazing philosopher. English, moves to America, living out during the period of World War II and surviving until the 1960s, I believe. He's a mathematician, works in realms like the philosophy of mathematics, or philosophy of math, very heady, somewhat abstract materials, which we won't bother with. An excellent text by him, which I didn't list on your PowerPoint slides here, is called The Problems of Philosophy, in which he gives almost a SparkNotes version of the entire history of Western philosophy, from Plato up to his own time. It's eminently readable and very pleasurable to go through. But what I did want to at least hone in on briefly is Bertrand Russell's argument in an essay titled "Why I Am Not a Christian." As a British man coming out of the tail end of the Victorian era, it's scandalous to come out against Christianity publicly. And his argument against Christianity, on the one hand, is made possible by Nietzsche's 30 or 40 years previously, and centers mostly upon a contradiction between the existence of hell and the concept of a loving deity. For Bertrand Russell, it doesn't add up. I put this on here not to ramrod down anybody's throat these arguments against Christianity in canonical Western philosophy, but instead to show the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche going through time forward, as well as to understand where philosophy has been for the past 100 years. How we deal with that is up to you. But that you are aware of the, what is often called, intellectual milieu. If you have a cognizance, a recognition, an awareness of the history of ideas up to this point, and ideally how philosophers like Nietzsche and Russell set the stage and the intellectual tenor, the tone for the world in which you and I are inheritors of. These thoughts shape our world and our culture. And I think it's obvious and entirely accurate to say, will continue to. Sometimes we discuss this as the culture wars, which is not inaccurate. But these debates aren't superficial and aren't even especially new. The expressions that you and I see at this time are what Nietzsche spoke of metaphorically as ripples from a time when he, or even Socrates, first made waves by throwing a rock in a pond, putting a fly in the ointment of traditional belief, and made possible what most simply is skepticism, and most forcefully are challenging counter-arguments, challenging in multiple senses of the word. I'll leave you to go investigate that essay by Russell if you're interested, or other pieces of his life's work. For our purposes, before we end the video, one or two more things. And especially, what I did not want to neglect was a very small but insightful part of the philosophy of Ludwig Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein coins the term language games. And in one sense, absolutely every debate we've had on our discussion boards, the entirety of the history of philosophy, and theology as well, are nothing more than linguistic games of chess. We move the pieces in a certain way. Sometimes one side wins, sometimes the other. And that all we're doing is playing language games, playing games of chess. Sometimes one side wins, and sometimes the other. But furthermore, or more importantly, the insight about language games is that regarding matters of philosophy and theology, many of our discussions can go around and around in circles without end. But in some fields, the hard sciences, for example, reality serves as a kind of backstop, like on a basketball goal, where, to take an example, a famous theological, philosophical question involves asking, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? And you can answer anything to that, because no one can tell if you're right or wrong. In even more concrete, relevant, less abstract ways, is God one person or three persons? Are our lives expressive of free will or predetermination, a type of determinism? Is the afterlife infinite, or do we reincarnate? Is there a hell or a heaven, and what is its nature? No one can tell who has a right answer. To use our basketball goal analogy, you can throw up your idea, but there's nothing for it to bounce off of. But if I ask, how many days are in a year? What is the color of the sky? What is the frequency of the radio bursts from a distant star? Or what are the measurements of the frequency for a wavelength of light? How many people are on the earth? What is the temperature of the ocean or the atmosphere? Those are things that language games can't go on indefinitely about. We can get clear answers on those. And the reason why is that when we toss up an idea about something we can empirically determine, reality is like a backstop. It bounces back our idea back at us. And if we've got the right idea, we can tell. And if we've shot wide, we can tell we're off the mark. But unlike at least some matters of philosophy and some matters of theology, there's no need or reason for these debates to continue indefinitely. Because with empirically observable evidence, unlike the supernatural, or perhaps even ethics, we can tell what's right and what's wrong. Now, in the context of our discussion of philosophy, that might give us pessimism about answering what is right and what is just regarding things like our justice system, or abortion and homosexuality. It's not an end-all be-all, but it does provide some relevant context that cultures are fluid and carry on in their wrangling with issues such as those. And that this differentiates philosophical and theological debates, which, if Wittgenstein is correct, especially in matters of, is there a God, what's that God's nature, and what is the nature of the afterlife, those we can't answer for sure. And what this likely means personally is that we should likely have humility. Regardless of how devout we may be, we can't know for sure that one religion is any more right than the other. We can think, have suspicions, argue and persuade, but we can't tell. We can't know for sure. We are epistemologically limited. And that furthermore, we can't know for sure that anybody else's religion is wrong. And between William James and his will to believe, and Ludwig Wittgenstein and his language games, that might provide us some better context for making do, not just sense of, but making do with the variety of beliefs that probably will have to coexist in human civilization. Diversity, almost without a doubt, will persist. And given this context, I think it will be likely that we could coexist if there was some way that we could all have humility, a Socratic humility, and say, I believe, but I can't ultimately know. Now, I leave that to you to determine if that's good, or if it's accurate. And I mean that very seriously and literally. Is it good to have humility about what we are capable of knowing? I would think it's obvious to argue yes, but there are counter-arguments. And even furthermore, is any of this even right? You can certainly argue to the contrary. But these seem well-founded and well-based. So I'll leave off for now, and we'll pick up next week with most of the rest of the 20th century, moving up into our own time.